The morning of June 7th, 1944, dawned cold and grey over the hedgerow country of Normandy, France. A light drizzle fell across the ancient farmland, turning the narrow dirt roads into ribbons of mud. Somewhere in this labyrinth of stone walls and dense vegetation, tens of thousands of German soldiers were regrouping after the initial landings, preparing counterattacks that military strategists believed could push the invading forces back into the sea. The American paratroopers scattered across the countryside that morning had every reason to believe they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of those soldiers on either side could have imagined was that the fate of thousands would soon rest not on artillery or armor, but on 300 meters of ordinary fishing line and the desperate ingenuity of a 38-year-old maintenance worker from Wisconsin who had never fired a weapon in anger before that week. Thomas Harrigan had been a father of 3 before the conflict began. His wife Margaret had passed away from pneumonia in 1941, leaving him to raise 2 daughters and a son alone while working double shifts at the paper mill in Green Bay. When the draft notice came in early 1943, he had tried to claim hardship exemption, but the local board was unsympathetic. His elderly mother would care for the children, they said. His country needed him more than his children did. By June of 1944, Private Harrigan of the 101st Airborne Division found himself somewhere in France, with no clear idea of where his unit was, armed with a rifle he barely knew how to use, and carrying in his pack the letters from his children that he read every night before sleeping. The jump into Normandy had scattered Harrigan's company across 15 kilometers of hostile territory. He had landed badly in an apple orchard, twisting his ankle so severely that he could barely walk. For 2 days, he had hidden in a collapsed barn, eating the emergency rations he carried and listening to the sounds of vehicles moving along the nearby roads. Through cracks in the wooden walls, he watched columns of German infantry march past, their field grey uniforms blending with the mist, their boots striking the ground in steady rhythm that seemed to shake the earth itself. By the 3rd morning, Harrigan knew he could not stay hidden any longer. His ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, his water was gone, and he had heard enough German voices around the barn to know that the area was heavily occupied. He gathered his equipment, checked his rifle one more time, and prepared to attempt reaching American lines. But as he emerged from the barn into the pre-dawn darkness, he froze. Less than 200 meters away, illuminated by the grey light of approaching dawn, stood what appeared to be an entire battalion of German soldiers. They were assembled in a narrow valley between 2 ridgelines, their vehicles and equipment spread out along a sunken road that ran through the depression. Harrigan counted at least 40 trucks, numerous motorcycles with sidecars, several armored cars, and what looked like mobile artillery pieces. The men themselves numbered in the thousands, far more than he could accurately estimate. They appeared to be preparing for a major movement, with officers moving between units and men checking equipment. Harrigan retreated back into the barn, his heart hammering. He knew from his training that American forces in this sector were spread dangerously thin, still trying to link up isolated units and establish a continuous defensive line. If this German force moved against those positions, they could potentially break through to the beaches and threaten the entire landing operation. But what could one man with a twisted ankle and 8 bullets do against thousands? He thought of his children back in Wisconsin. His oldest daughter, Sarah, was 14, already taking on the role of woman of the house. His son, David, was 11, trying so hard to be brave when his father left. Little Emma was only 8, and she had cried for 2 hours at the train station. Harrigan had promised them all he would come home. He had promised he would be careful. He had promised he would not take unnecessary risks. But he had also promised his country that he would do his duty when called upon. Harrigan examined his equipment methodically. He had 5 fragmentation grenades, 1 rifle, 8 rounds of ammunition, a combat knife, and various personal items. In one pocket of his pack, he found something that made him pause. It was a spool of fishing line he had brought from home, heavy-duty monofilament that he used for northern pike fishing in Green Bay. He had packed it on impulse, thinking perhaps he might have opportunities to catch fish to supplement army rations. The spool contained roughly 300 meters of 20-kilogram test line, nearly invisible and remarkably strong. An idea began forming in Harrigan's mind. It was absurd, perhaps even ridiculous, but it was also the only idea he had. The sunken road where the German force was assembling ran through a natural bottleneck, with steep embankments on both sides covered in thick brush and old-growth trees. The road itself was barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass side by side, and it stretched for approximately 500 meters before opening into farmland on the far end. If that column began moving along that road, they would be compressed into a long, vulnerable line. Harrigan spent the next 2 hours working through pain that made his vision blur. He moved along one side of the embankment, staying low in the brush, stringing his fishing line from tree to tree at various heights. He tied loops and slip knots, creating a complex web of nearly invisible barriers across the narrow passage. Every few meters, he attached one of his grenades to a tree, securing the fishing line to the grenade pins in such a way that sufficient tension would pull the pins free. The principle was simple. When the lead vehicles hit the lower fishing lines stretched across the road, they would pull tight. The tension would travel along the line to the grenades positioned at the sides of the road. The pins would be pulled. The grenades would detonate. The narrow confines of the sunken road would amplify the effect, and the steep embankments would make it extremely difficult for vehicles to maneuver around obstacles. But Harrigan's plan had a second, more ambitious component. He did not want to merely delay the column, he wanted to trap it entirely. After placing his grenades along the first 200 meters of road, he moved to the far end of the sunken passage, where the road emerged into open farmland. Here he used the remaining fishing line to create a more subtle trap. He strung line at ankle height across the road exit, but instead of attaching grenades, he tied the lines to several dead branches he positioned precariously on the embankment above the road. The branches were large, heavy with leaves, and positioned to fall across the road exit when disturbed. It would not stop vehicles, but it would slow them, and more importantly, it would create confusion about whether the road ahead was obstructed. Harrigan knew that his improvised trap had enormous weaknesses. The fishing line might be spotted. A single soldier checking the route could disarm everything. The grenades might not detonate properly. The tension required to pull the pins might be too great for the thin line to achieve, and even if everything worked perfectly, 5 grenades could not stop thousands of soldiers. At best, he might create a brief delay, a moment of confusion, but sometimes, he thought as he finished his preparations and dragged himself back up the embankment to a hidden observation position, a moment of confusion is all that history needs. The German column began moving shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning. Harrigan watched from his concealed position among the bushes, roughly 100 meters from the road below. Through the mist and light rain, he could see officers directing traffic, motorcycles with sidecars taking positions at the front of the column, and truck after truck loaded with soldiers rolling into position. The sound of engines filled the valley, a deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The lead motorcycle entered the sunken road first, moving slowly as the driver navigated the narrow passage. Behind it came an armored car, then trucks, then more motorcycles, then infantry on foot between the vehicles. Within minutes, the entire sunken road was packed with men and machines, a column extending the full 500 meters of the passage. The Germans had done exactly what Harrigan had hoped they would do, compressing their entire force into the vulnerable bottleneck. Harrigan's hands shook as he watched. Part of him wanted the lead vehicles to simply pass through without incident, to miss the lines entirely, to let this moment pass, so he would not have to live with the consequences of what he had done. Another part of him thought of those American soldiers scattered across the hedgerows, outnumbered and outgunned, depending on men they did not even know to buy them time. The lead motorcycle struck the first fishing line at precisely 10:23 in the morning. Harrigan saw the line go taut, saw it pull against the trees, saw the tension travel along its length. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the first grenade detonated. The explosion was not particularly large by military standards, but in the confined space of the sunken road, the effect was dramatic. The motorcycle tumbled sideways, its driver thrown clear. The armored car behind it lurched to a stop, its commander emerging from the top hatch to assess the situation. Men began shouting in German, voices overlapping in confusion. Then the second grenade detonated, then the third. Harrigan had spaced his grenades deliberately, each positioned to be triggered by different fishing lines at different points. As vehicles tried to reverse or maneuver around the obstacles created by the first explosion, they pulled other lines tight, triggering additional blasts. The fourth and fifth grenades detonated nearly simultaneously, creating a barrier of smoke and debris across the narrowest portion of the road. The column came to a complete halt. What happened next, Harrigan would later struggle to explain adequately to intelligence officers who questioned him. The German force did not simply stop and clear the road. They reacted as though they were under sustained attack from a significant enemy presence. Soldiers dismounted from trucks and took defensive positions along the embankments. Officers shouted orders. Machine guns were set up facing the woods. Radio operators began transmitting urgently. The entire battalion went into defensive posture, expecting an ambush that did not exist. And that defensive posture created a new problem. With thousands of soldiers now spread out along the embankments in defensive positions, the column could not easily resume movement. Vehicles could not turn around in the narrow space. Men blocked the road as they took cover. What had been an organized movement formation became a stationary defensive perimeter, packed into a sunken road that offered no room for maneuver. For 3 hours, Harrigan watched as German officers tried to reorganize their force. They sent scouts into the woods who found nothing. They sent engineers to clear the road, who worked slowly, expecting enemy fire at any moment. They established security perimeters and brought up additional units to reinforce their position against an attack that never came. The entire battalion, along with its vehicles and equipment, remained effectively trapped in place by the fear of an ambush that consisted of one injured paratrooper with no ammunition left and fishing line from Wisconsin. What Harrigan did not know, could not have known, was that his actions had triggered something far larger than he had imagined. The German radio transmissions reporting an ambush in the sector reached the division headquarters. The division commander, believing that American forces had infiltrated in strength behind his lines, halted 2 other battalions that were preparing to advance toward the beaches. He repositioned his reserve companies to prepare for what he believed was a coordinated attack against his rear areas. He delayed his planned counterattack by 6 hours while he attempted to assess the situation and secure his flanks. Those 6 hours changed everything. By the time the German battalion finally cleared the sunken road and resumed movement, American forces in the sector had used the unexpected breathing space to consolidate their positions. Scattered paratroopers had linked up with units advancing from the beaches. Artillery had been brought forward. Communication lines had been established. What had been a dangerously thin and disorganized defensive line had become a coordinated defensive position. When the delayed German counterattack finally came, it struck not scattered remnants, but organized resistance. The attack failed. The American foothold in Normandy held. Harrigan did not witness any of this. Shortly after the German column finally began moving again in the late afternoon, he dragged himself away from his observation position and began hobbling east, using his rifle as a crutch. His ankle had swollen so badly that his boot had to be cut away. He had not eaten in nearly 4 days. He collapsed twice from exhaustion, before he was found by a patrol from the 101st Airborne Division on June 8th, delirious with fever and barely conscious. He woke up 3 days later in a field hospital, his ankle in a cast, his fever broken, and a captain from military intelligence sitting beside his bed with a notebook. The captain's name was Morrison, and he had been trying to piece together the events in the sector where Harrigan had been operating. The Germans had reported significant resistance in that area, but American forces had no record of any unit engaging the enemy there during those specific hours. Morrison had interviewed dozens of soldiers, examined German prisoners, and reviewed captured documents, trying to understand what had happened. Then someone remembered the delirious soldier who kept talking about fishing line and grenades. Morrison listened to Harrigan's story with an expression that shifted from skepticism to astonishment. He made Harrigan repeat certain details multiple times, taking careful notes. Then he left without comment, and Harrigan did not see him again for 2 weeks. When Morrison returned, He brought with him a colonel from division headquarters and a combat photographer. The colonel sat down beside Harrigan's bed and told him something that Harrigan found difficult to believe. Intelligence estimates indicated that Harrigan's improvised trap had delayed approximately 10,000 German soldiers for between 3 and 6 hours during a critical period. That delay had contributed to the failure of a major counterattack that could have threatened the entire landing operation. The fishing line and grenades had not stopped the Germans, but they had bought time, and time had been the most valuable commodity in Normandy during those desperate first days. The colonel also told him something else. During the confusion in the sunken road, at least 24 German soldiers had been injured by the grenade detonations or in the chaos that followed. Several vehicles had been damaged. Equipment had been lost. But more significantly, the psychological impact of the apparent ambush had spread throughout the German division, contributing to a general sense that American forces were more numerous and better organized than they actually were. Fear, the colonel said, could be as powerful a weapon as bullets. Harrigan asked if he would be returning to his unit. The colonel shook his head. The ankle injury was severe enough to warrant evacuation back to England for proper treatment, and from there, likely back to the United States. The conflict in Normandy would continue without him. His part in it was over. Before leaving, Morrison handed Harrigan a small package. Inside was a spool of fishing line, new and unused. A note attached to it read, "From the boys of the 101st, for when you get home, catch a big one for us." Harrigan returned to Wisconsin in August of 1944. His ankle never fully healed, leaving him with a permanent limp. He returned to his job at the paper mill, working reduced hours due to his injury. He resumed his life as a single father, raising his 3 children with help from his mother and the close-knit community of Green Bay. He rarely spoke about the events in Normandy. When asked about his service, he would say simply that he had been injured during the landing and sent home. He did not mention the fishing line, the grenades, or the sunken road. He filed the letters he had carried through France in a box in his attic and tried not to think about the men he had injured or the fear he had created. But sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings, he would take his son David fishing on the bay. They would cast their lines into the grey water, watching the monofilament arc through the air, nearly invisible against the sky. And Harrigan would think about tension and timing, about moments when small things matter enormously, about the strange unpredictability of human events. David would ask what he was thinking about. Harrigan would smile and say he was thinking about fish. It was not until 1968, when David was serving his own tour in Vietnam, that Harrigan finally told his children the complete story of what had happened in France. David had written home expressing frustration that nothing he did seemed to matter in the larger scheme of the conflict. He felt like one small person in an enormous machine, powerless to influence events that would unfold with or without him. Harrigan wrote back with a long letter describing in detail his 3 days in Normandy. He told David about the fear, the pain, the absurd idea of using fishing line against thousands of soldiers. He told him about the ridiculous improbability that it had worked at all, and about the even more improbable fact that it had mattered. He told him that history is not made only by generals and politicians, but sometimes by ordinary people doing small things that ripple outward in ways no one can predict or control. David kept that letter. Years later, after both men had passed away, David's daughter found it among his belongings and donated it to the National World War II Museum. The letter now resides in their archives, along with a spool of fishing line that Thomas Harrigan kept on his dresser for the rest of his life, never used. A reminder of the morning when 300 meters of monofilament changed the course of history for thousands of men. The German battalion that was delayed in the sunken road suffered heavy casualties during the remainder of the Normandy campaign. More than 60% of the unit was lost by the time they retreated from France in August. The officers who had commanded the force that day survived the conflict and were interviewed by historians in the decades that followed. Several of them mentioned the ambush in the sunken road as a turning point in their experience of the invasion, the moment when they first understood that the situation in Normandy was far more serious than they had been told to expect. None of them ever learned that their ambush had consisted of 1 man, 5 grenades and fishing line from Wisconsin. The American forces in the sector where Harrigan operated eventually linked up with the main landing forces and participated in the breakout from Normandy. The 101st Airborne Division went on to fight in the Netherlands and Belgium, earning distinction that added to their already legendary reputation. Many of the men who benefited from the delay Harrigan created never knew why their defensive positions had held, why the expected counterattack had come so late, why they had been given time to prepare. In military history, the events of June 7, 1944, in that particular sector of Normandy, are typically described as a period of German confusion and delayed response. Historians attribute this to poor intelligence, communication difficulties, and the general chaos that characterized the early days of the invasion. The role of Thomas Harrigan's improvised trap is mentioned in only a few specialized studies, and even there it is often treated as an interesting footnote rather than a significant factor. But to the men who were there, who lived through those desperate first days when the outcome was far from certain, those hours mattered immensely. Time was measured not in days, but in minutes. A delay of 6 hours was an eternity. A moment of confusion could mean the difference between survival and defeat. And the actions of one injured paratrooper, with fishing line and grenades, however improbable, however ridiculous, had bought them that time. Thomas Harrigan lived to be 79 years old. He died in 1985, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His obituary in the Green Bay newspaper mentioned his service in France, but provided no details. He was buried with military honors in a small cemetery outside the city, his gravestone noting simply his name, dates, and the inscription 101st Airborne Division, World War II. 3 months after his funeral, a letter arrived at his daughter Sarah's home from France. It was from a French historian who had been researching the events in Normandy and had come across references to Harrigan's actions in American military archives. The historian wanted to know if the family had any additional information, any personal papers or letters that might provide more detail about what had happened. He was writing a book about the small, often overlooked actions that had contributed to the success of the invasion. Sarah sent him copies of the letter her father had written to David in 1968, along with photographs of the fishing line spool that she had kept after her father's death. The historian wrote back expressing his gratitude and his amazement. He had interviewed dozens of veterans and examined countless documents, but this was the first time he had encountered such a clear personal account of someone using such unorthodox methods to achieve significant tactical impact. The book was published in 1987. It devoted an entire chapter to Thomas Harrigan and the fishing line trap. The chapter was titled The Ridiculous Weapon. It described in detail the improvised nature of the trap, the improbable success of its implementation, and the significant strategic impact of the delay it created. The book became required reading at several military academies, used as an example of creativity, adaptability, and the importance of individual initiative in combat situations. Sarah read the chapter with tears in her eyes. She remembered her father as a quiet man who worked hard, loved his children, and went fishing on Sunday mornings. She had not fully understood until reading those pages just how extraordinary his actions had been, or how many lives had been affected by what he had done in those 3 days in France. She understood now why he had carried that fishing line spool on his dresser, why he had sometimes stared at it with an expression she could not interpret, why he had kept it even when the plastic yellowed and cracked with age. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder of the weight of small actions, of the responsibility that comes with moments of decision, of the knowledge that what seems ridiculous in the moment can become significant in hindsight. The sunken road in Normandy, where the events occurred, is now part of a marked historical trail that tourists can walk. A small plaque was installed in 1992 describing the action that took place there in June of 1944. The plaque mentions Thomas Harrigan by name and provides a brief summary of what he did. It does not mention the fishing line specifically, referring instead to improvised obstacles, but local tour guides know the full story and often share it with visitors who stop to read the marker. Several veterans of the 101st Airborne Division who knew Harrigan or served in the same sector during those days have visited the site over the years. They stand beside the plaque, looking at the embankments and the narrow road. Trying to imagine one injured man stringing fishing line in the darkness while thousands of enemy soldiers gathered nearby. Some of them leave small tokens, coins or patches, or simple notes of thanks. One veteran, visiting with his grandson in 2003, left a fishing lure attached to the plaque, a small tribute to the ridiculous weapon that had saved lives. The German military records captured after the conflict contain numerous references to the incident in the sunken road. Reports describe an ambush by unknown forces, use of improvised devices, and significant disruption to planned operations. One report, filed by a junior officer who had been in the lead vehicle, notes with frustration that despite extensive searches, no enemy soldiers were found in the immediate area, and the devices used appeared to have been extremely simple in design. The officer expressed bewilderment that such basic methods had been so effective against a force of their size and capability. That bewilderment reflects a larger truth about the nature of conflicts and the unexpected ways they unfold. Military planning emphasizes organization, firepower, training, and coordination. Generals move divisions on maps and calculate odds based on numerical superiority. But on the ground, in the actual moment of action, history is often made by individuals responding to specific circumstances with whatever tools they have available. A fishing line becomes a weapon. A delay of hours becomes strategically significant. One man's ridiculous idea changes the outcome for thousands. Thomas Harrigan could not have predicted any of this when he strung fishing line between trees on a rainy morning in June of 1944. He was simply trying to survive, trying to do something useful, trying to make his presence in that moment matter. He was thinking about his children back home and the promise he had made to return to them. He was thinking about the men he had seen marching along the roads and the vulnerable American positions he knew existed somewhere in the hedgerows. He was thinking that even if his plan was ridiculous, even if it failed completely, at least he would have tried. And in the trying, he created something that rippled outward far beyond his ability to see or comprehend. He gave time to men who desperately needed it. He created fear where confidence had existed. He proved that ingenuity could overcome impossible odds, that ordinary materials could become extraordinary weapons, that one person could matter even in the face of thousands. He demonstrated that the line between the ridiculous and the heroic is sometimes thinner than fishing line and just as strong. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.